So let's get started. It's a great pleasure, Dr. Susan Stronge here to give the anniversary lecture at the Royal Asiatic Society. She is the just retired Senior Curator in Asian Art at the V&A, and she really requires no introduction. Here you will know her from many of her exhibitions and books that have deal with the Mughals, particularly as being the editor and principal contributor to the Great Mughals exhibition and catalog, which is here. And I know that everybody has seen it. And I will point out the fact that the star of the show was the Gulistan of Sadi, which is right at the beginning of the exhibition on the left as you enter it. And I was also pleased to see that the pages that were open to were not the obvious ones that one would have picked, but ones that featured beautiful calligraphy as well as wonderful drawings of birds and flowers. She, in the past, has her earlier books on the Mughals. There's painting for the Mughal Emperor in 2002, and Made for Mughal Emperors in 2010. She's also written more broadly on other Indian courts, particularly the Sikh courts and Tipu Sultan. But I wanted to call attention to her first book, and we won't say the year in which it was published, but it was on beadry ware, which is the inlaid metalwork, which is often ornamented with silver and highly incised work. Which, when I was a young graduate student, I'm a lapsed art historian, by the way. When I was a young graduate student, I was introduced to this book. And what was astounding about it is that it took what an area of artistic expression which had often been somewhat pejoratively called decorative art, and realized that the artistic production of this type of metalwork was of really the highest artistic standard that one could find anywhere. And I was pleased when I went to the Great Mughal show at the opening to see that her broad understanding of what constitutes the greatest treasures of the Mughals includes many things such as metalwork, ordinary wares that one would find, albeit in a palace, were worthy of equal attention to things that people mostly associated with the Mughals, fantastic jewels and miniature paintings and the like. And so it is this very broad church that Susan brought to the Mughal exhibition that made it the success that it has been. And I may be reading things into it, but it is something that one can draw back to her very first publication. So she's going to give us a post-mortem on the exhibition now, as it's actually shot a few days ago. But it'll, this being a very good Buddhist and Hindu organization, it'll be reborn in Hong Kong and Virginia in the coming years. So, Susan, thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I should confess that the Bidri book, I think, came out the week before my second son was born, and he is now nearly 40. So how time flies. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. I was very aware that I've given quite a lot of talks about the exhibition, and even more aware that some of you would have heard more than one. So it was a bit of a challenge to decide how to how to formulate it. And so I thought really I would touch on the thinking behind some of the display and highlight what in the exhibition was entirely new in terms of research areas, what was relatively new who'd published their work but hadn't been included in an exhibition before, and what remains unresolved. And so inevitably it's concentrating as much on the book and its multiple contributors as much as on the exhibition. So if we begin with, sorry, I skipped one immediately. Do I have to point at the screen? Oh, possibly. Anyway, just skipping over, obviously it covers the reigns of Akbar, Jahangir and Shah Jahan.
Is it you? Are you able to?
That is the right
Oh, it is the
yeah,
right
yeah,
side.
it is. Yeah. No, it jumped to at the beginning, sorry. Yeah. And geographically, it covers the area in yellow on the map on the right. So I don't need to explain to this audience who these emperors were, but this was the great age of Mughal art, and the time span of the exhibition was about 1560 to about 1660. A lot of objects obviously can't be precisely datable, so they may spill outside that, that time span. Now, the arrangement of the exhibition is absolutely simple. It's regnal. This is an exhibition that was aimed at a very general audience, many of whom may never have heard of some of these emperors before. So it was essential to keep the structure very simple and the story as simple as possible, perhaps oversimplified, and I'll touch on that at one point. But basically, it was divided into 3 reigns, and Jahangir had 2 separate rooms, which I think says a lot for the works that were shown there. But also, in terms of the V&A layout, we were very fortunate to have 2 symmetrical rooms with a very small gap between them. If we'd had, sometimes we have different galleries with a long corridor, which is never decorated, and so you kind of lose the spell of the atmosphere of the show by going out of it and then coming back in. But we were very fortunate that this didn't happen, and the designers, OMMX, were fantastic to work with, and because they're architects, I think the spacing of the show was also very cleverly done. The arrangement of the exhibition, because it was multimedia, was something obviously I gave a lot of thought to at the beginning, because it wasn't going to be possible to have, say, the history of the art of the book running through the exhibition. So I decided to arrange it by workshops, but needed a key object at the beginning just to introduce the whole subject. And so we had one spectacular piece, very generously lent by the Carlos Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon. And this tied together various themes of the show. So it alludes to the Mughal Emperor's Timurid ancestry, because it was made for Timur's grandson, Ulugh Beg. It was then inscribed to Jahangir and then to Shah Jahan. So it introduces the lineage, but also the fact of the Persian language being the language, not just of the culture of the court, but also the administrative language of the empire. So just in one object, which is extremely beautiful, you have all these things. Now, the other aspect of this, and I'll come to this in a second in more detail, is that the maker of this, it's been speculated, is Saidar, an Iranian craftsman who added the handle. And if you look at it, I don't know if it comes across on the slide, but if you see the piece, the handle is actually a slightly different jade colour. And when we were installing it, Jessica Hallett of the Gulbenkian was pointing out the red enamel on this bit, on the tongue of the dragon head, which is as if it's got flames coming out of its mouth. But the red enamel also does indicate that it's probably a Mughal edition, because of course enamel becomes important in the reign of Shah Jahan when it came into Mughal hands. So the reign of Akbar is the beginning. And the arrangement of this disparate material, I took a cue from Abul Fazl, the author of the Akbarnama, who includes a survey of the institutions of the court and refers to some of the royal workshops, and begins with the House of Books. When he describes the House of Books, he gives primacy to calligraphy. And so we have in the V&A some monumental folios from a Quran, which exists at the moment, as far as we know, in just one volume. And these three very about that size were folios I'd known all the time I'd been in the museum, but they were detached, they were in huge glass sandwiches. As far as I know, they'd never been displayed. And so when I was looking at the acquisition details, it transpired that they'd actually been acquired originally, oddly, by the Science Museum Library in 1880. And the story that they had was that they'd been taken by an English officer, obviously stolen, I think, from the library, the Royal Library in 1857 in Delhi, then acquired by the Science Museum. And then I think George Birdwood suggested that it would be more suitable that they were in the V&A, so they were moved to the V&A. Now, I couldn't find the rest of the volume because these had been so long separated that the others hadn't actually been, the other folios hadn't been given an acquisition number. So there was a fairly anxious period when I thought, what on earth happened to the volume? But it did turn up and it is now properly acquisitioned, but these were always detached. So we put them on show at the beginning, this monumental calligraphy. And then Ursula Sims Williams of the British Library very kindly agreed to write up an analysis of the Persian inscriptions and the seals that were added firstly by Shah Jahan's librarians, showing that it had been in the Imperial Library, and the date range of the seals and inscriptions is 1636 to 1736. So obviously an extremely important Quran. And then just to show that just to get away from the division of so-called fine and decorative art and to show how important calligraphy was, I included immediately afterwards in the display this ablution vessel, which has very fine calligraphy on it, as well as bringing together different traditions. So the shape is very Hindustani, the decoration is very Safavid, and this, of course, reflects the makeup of the people making things for the court. There were a lot of Iranian poets, calligraphers, architects, metalworkers, and so on. So also this was a very well-known object, the ablution vessel, but given great prominence in its new display, beautifully lit. Then the traditions that were coming together in this creation of a new art under Akbar, the Hindustani traditions, the multiple traditions colliding with Safavid traditions of the supervisors of the royal workshops, I think is shown very effectively in this painting from the Hamzanama from the MAC in Vienna, where you can see the top section of the sleeping king is very Hindustani, and the Dev at the bottom is a wild version of Safavid tradition. So that was a very neat way of bringing visually something which is very striking, but also explained an important theme. But I was also very aware that many people not familiar with Mughal or Mughal manuscripts sometimes think that when they see paintings in the V&A on the wall, that's how they were. So it was very, very important to me to show complete manuscripts. And thank you, everyone, for lending these. This was extremely important. They were properly displayed so you could see them, which is not always the case. It's always a lighting challenge to show these. Now, the other theme that got a bit lost and seems to be a standard feature of doing any Mughal exhibition is to represent the royal women, because the depiction of women is much less than the men, but also the objects tend to be inscribed to the emperors, not to their wives. So it's very difficult to represent these women who were very powerful, very wealthy, and often great patrons of architecture, as we know, but this wasn't a show where it was possible to include much of the architectural detail. At one point, I'd thought perhaps we would have big photographic reproductions of some of the monuments, but that didn't work out in the design because it took up too much wall space. But I was very pleased that we could put in a manuscript like this, or put in highlight this painting, which is a very beautiful scene of Akbar recognizing his mother after this period of separation when his father Humayun and his mother had to flee into exile into Iran. The next workshop was the goldsmiths, and that again, it presents enormous challenges because so little has survived from this period, which is authentic. And yet you can see from this, the spoon particularly, which is of the period of Akbar, which is the section it came into, is superlative quality. And it also introduces, again, is completely Hindustani. It's the Kundan gold setting technique, which is unique to the subcontinent and allows for this very delicate setting of stones. But the form it's been suggested the form is European, reflecting the arrival of European art in the late 16th century. And the design again is very Iranian. But I couldn't find any more that were definitely of the period and that I could include here. So in the same case was this absolutely magnificent dagger and scabbard from the Al-Sabar collection. And of course, this was the major lender to the show. Some of the most spectacular pieces were from this collection. And this is just a bit later, but it's exactly the same technique. And you can see the continuation of style, but you can also see the delicacy of the setting. I don't know if you can make out here, for instance, the birds with their wings spread out facing each other. And you see the quantities of stones that were used to set into this. And every time I see these statistics, I imagine Manuel Keane, the curator of the Al-Sabar collection, counting every single one and wondering how on earth he did it. I mean, it was astonishing. We also had, I see there's a spelling mistake. We also had a last minute panic because you won't be able to see, but the teeth, I think it's not even included in the image, the teeth of this feline head are ivory. Now, anyone who's involved in, yes, all the museum curators will groan because no one would have noticed this, but the accuracy of the description is such that Manuel, of course, did identify the ivory. Now, we groan because the CITES regulations for the movement of ivory across the world are absolutely appalling, and that we had a last-minute panic that this might actually not come, which would have been a catastrophe because it really was one of the big stars of the show. Anyway, as you can see, it did. And then we had the carpet workshops. The essay by Stephen Cohen in the book points out the original features of this carpet in comparison with the Safavid carpets that Akbar wanted his workshops to emulate. Of course, it's a unique carpet. It's in a very different style. Instead of conforming to the usual conventions of symmetry, it treats the surface like a painter would. And so you have all these different little scenes that with mysteriously unconnected. I mean, there must be a narrative behind it, which is now lost. But you can see also the links between the contemporary paintings and drawings and the carpet production. And this specific motif of this mythical being also appeared on architecture at the same time. So this was a kind of sub-theme throughout the exhibition, that the interconnectivity of the designs supplied by artists and their realization in different media. The other thing that I wanted to do was include metalwork, because I'm very fond of metalwork myself. But the problem with doing metalwork of this period is that if you have uninscribed, undecorated metalwork, it's very difficult to date. It's very difficult to be sure where and when it was made. And the ewer on the left from the Ashmolean, I think, has travelled from its attributions, I think, have been to Iran, certainly to the Deccan. Anyway, now we've put it in the Mughal Empire, I think, because of the foot is particularly, looks like, the pierced decoration looks like that on other metalwork, which is definitely Hindustani. But the ewer is obviously replicates a leather shape, and I just thought putting them together shows the ingenuity and the creativity of the forms that were being produced in the metalworking workshops, probably across the empire, and the extraordinary skills that were being applied to these metal forms. But the one thing that you can do is use contemporary paintings to help date these pieces. So in this scene from a page from the V&A Akbarnama, you will see, this is the birth of Murad, Akbar's son. You will see in the detail a ewer, and it's not very close to the one in the Ashmolean, but look particularly at the brazier and especially to this covered vessel here, and to the divination ring being held up by the astrologers who are casting the horoscope for the new prince. And you will see in the display that we have a very closely similar vessel here. We have a divination ring. And that's really the only way that you can date them. And the brazier, again, is not very close, but you can see that these extravagant curling feet are not imaginary as they are depicted on the paintings. So one of the other things I wanted to do as well was to get away from the idea that the emperor was the only person ever commissioning anything and was standing over all the artists and craftsmen and watching what was done and controlling what was done, which is sometimes implied in the older art historical literature. If you look at the contemporary sources, you will see many references to governors of different provinces bringing to the court the special products of those provinces. Now, the problem is that we don't know what they look like because a lot of them are just described as textiles, and virtually no textiles survive from this period. And where it just generally says the specialities of the province. But in the V&A, we have a collection of material from, well, this isn't the V&A, but I'll begin with this one. The province of Gujarat was extraordinarily wealthy and had its own very deeply embedded traditions. And together with the collections from the pieces from the V&A, we can put together a picture of what was being produced. And the foundation research, of course, on this subject was done by Simon Digby from the 1982 Indian Heritage Exhibition. The conference that was held then had a paper given by Simon Digby, which was the foundation of all the research on this style of mother of pearl ornamentation that's been done ever since. But this is a particular shield which was in the collection of the Medici in Florence by 1599. And in the book, we have a piece by Adriana Conchin, who at the time was my exhibition research assistant. She's a specialist in Habsburg and Medici archives particularly, but she's an art historian. And she went to the archives and wrote a piece about this, correcting some of the details in a slightly misleading article that appeared, I think, last year in the Burlington. And we were very fortunate as well to have, at the same time, Ratish Nanda in Delhi had been recreating a canopy which had been made in Gujarat, but sent to the shrine of Nizamuddin Aulia by the Mughal governor in the early 17th century. And in doing so, was reviving a completely lost craft. And so we were very fortunate to have some of the film that they supplied, which we put into the exhibition. But this is the top of a full front cabinet in the V&A, and you can see how beautiful it is, the style, but also how it must reflect a very old tradition. Simon Digby could track it to the early 16th century, so long before the Mughals came into the subcontinent and took over the province of Gujarat. And then the other related style of mother of pearl wares, which was being produced in the province, are these pieces which were probably made for Goa, but also would have circulated within the Mughal court. And the piece on the left hadn't been published before as a Mughal period piece or Gujarati. I think it was acquired by the museum as Italian, probably in 1857. But then that's quite standard. So then we move to the reign of Jahangir, and we begin with the look of the exhibition changed as we went from one reign to another. And so here we have this rather pretty light design projected onto the floor, which replicates a design from the floor of the tomb of Itimad-ud-Dawla and Esmat Begum in Agra. But there's a lot of space, as you can see, and it had a different color. It had a completely different feel. But we had a section on coins, and the essay on this for the exhibition book was written by Shailendra Bandare from the Ashmolean, and his subtitle I thought was really apt. It's Art and Poetry in Circulation, and I think that's perfect to describe these coins of Jahangir. Of course, he claimed to have invented the whole notion of zodiacal coins, which wasn't entirely true. But they are very beautiful, and his coins were characterized by continuing purity of the gold, but also by extremely fine calligraphy and Persian verses that were added to them. And the coins given by Jahangir, that this coin, this mohur on the top, would have been given to Jahangir's acolytes to wear on turbans, bearing his likeness, from the 6th regnal year. And he also gave one of these to Thomas Roe, the first English ambassador to the court. All this is in Shailendra's essay. But again, we can, in a rather feeble way, bring in the powerful women, in this case, Nur Jahan, who Jahangir married in 1611 and became extraordinarily powerful, as we know, as Jahangir's health declined significantly, particularly after 1620. She became more and more in control of all sorts of things, court ceremonials, and Jahangir allowed her to have these coins minted in her name. Then we have, in the next slide, we go back to Saidar. And here, this reflects research that was done in 1999, I think, by my husband, Sir Emilikin Shervani, and he brought together all the material that was known that he could find about Saidar, who was a remarkable craftsman. And it's a remarkable story because we know very little about any of the individuals who are producing art for the Mughal court. We know, I suppose, more about the architects, perhaps, but the painters we know remarkably little about, and certainly the craftsmen are rarely mentioned by name. But Saidar, who was from Gilan, is mentioned by Jahangir, both by his name and by the title, which was Bibad al-Khan, the peerless Khan. And he is mentioned in Jahangir's memoirs many times. He first appears mentioned as a poet because that was one of his great skills, that he specialized in chronograms, so poems giving within the particular phrases the date of the event being celebrated. But he was also, Suren discovered Persian sources which mentioned that he was also a specialist in working with hard stones. He was a calligrapher, and he was obviously an extremely nice man as well. So he was part of Jahangir's inner circle. And travelled with him as Jahangir travelled round. But he was also responsible for making these cups. The one on the left from the Altani collection is the earliest authentically dated Mughal jade, and the verses on it can be linked with verses of Saidar. So there are various strands of evidence that produce the supposition that this was he made this piece, that the calligraphy, we have a specimen of his calligraphy on a precious stone. We know for a fact that that was his calligraphy, and it's identical to the calligraphy in the top band there, and the poetry as well links it to him, plus his facility in jade working. And at this time, he was also the supervisor of the imperial goldsmiths, and he continued in that role under Shah Jahan as well. Now, jade was a new material in terms of court production. It was probably available in very small quantities, and I was discussing with Courtney Stewart a couple of days ago the jades in the exhibition, and she pointed out how small they are, which implies that the supplies were not enormous. And we know that jade as a raw material, thanks to the research of Robert Skelton many years ago, jade was there in the workshops as a raw material. So it would have been available, but these are the earliest known pieces, though there are some in the Barak Kalabavan which have spurious inscriptions on them. The next section, I included 3 pieces of Chinese porcelain which had entered the Mughal imperial collections, and really for my own benefit, having almost no knowledge of Chinese porcelain whatsoever, it just occurred to me that it would be interesting to move away from what's normally written about these Mughal inscribed Chinese porcelains and look at them from the Chinese perspective, how important they were in their own right. So Ricardo Brosch, then of the V&A, but now curator in Hamburg, wrote the chapter in the book about the significance of these pieces. And they were very, very rare, fine, and not usually, they certainly weren't. If they left China, they would have been coming out as very significant gifts. We don't know anything about how any of the pieces that I included in the show got to the Mughals. I mean, we know that they were because of these wonderful inscriptions on them. And one also has a weight given on the inscription, which implies that that was used for valuing the pieces, because you find it on gold artifacts as well at the same period. Now, next to the porcelains, I included jeweled jade because although this was a newly adopted material, it was also immediately embellished with precious stones and gold. So it's a very hard substance to work, hard literally, but also hard in terms of having the ability to work it. It can't be carved, it has to be abraded, and it's a very densely formed stone. So it requires considerable skill to work. And then to add precious stones as well is adding one extra level of complexity. But these show, the piece on the left is arguably a piece made for Jahangir. This is quite amusing because it includes an ostrich, which is apparently not native to the subcontinent. So how did that get into the royal menagerie? We don't know. The next piece was the marvelous canopy from the Bashir Mohammed family collection, which had appeared briefly and was first published by Rahul Jain, but was generally pretty much unknown and is in an extraordinary state of preservation. I slightly redated it. Rahul Jain, I think, put it in the reign of Akbar. I slightly redated it in relation to architectural ornamentation and also manuscript ornamentation. It seemed to fall just slightly later, but it doesn't detract from its enormous importance and great rarity. And then another very familiar textile is the famous coat in the V&A, but it's displayed in a slightly different way so that you can see the whole layout of the design. And my colleague at the V&A, Avalon Fotheringham, wrote an analysis for the book about the way in which it was made, the dyes used, even the needle used. And I suggested that perhaps the satin, which had not been discussed before, was actually Iranian. And here, this is where the great skills of the V&A experts come into play, because once the question was raised, Avalon said it wasn't Indian silk satin. So I said, well, where did it come from? So one option was China. So I went to the Chinese curator, who said immediately, no, the loom width is wrong. So it's not Chinese. Went to the European one. She said it probably wasn't. So that left the most likely source being Iran, because of course, big silk producer, and because of the constant trade links between the two. But Avalon, as well as writing it up, has done an absolutely brilliant film for the V&A website, so I'd highly recommend that as well. Then we come to the reflection of European presence at the Mughal court is often described through obviously the Jesuits who were bringing works of art and the travellers, but there were also people working within the workshops. And so there were the odd goldsmith, the odd diamond cutter. There was Shah Jahan had in his employ as a prince and as an emperor, a Dutch diamond cutter. But there was another chap who turned up who was a Frenchman called Augustin, who was born in Bordeaux and arrived in I think in 1616, and by 1620 had designed a throne for Jahangir. And his copies of letters that he wrote from Lahore in 1620 are in a French library now. But he also rarely, I mean, unusually, crops up in Jahangir's own memoirs. So he says that he gave this Farangi the title of Hunarmand. And so Augustin describes the throne that he designed for Jahangir and says it had 12 pillars, it had lions on the base of the pillars. And so this was obviously done under his direction and is a remarkable survivor from the period. Just gives you a glimpse of the internationalism of the court. Other very, very famous paintings, of course, need no introduction, I'm sure, to this audience. The remarkable studies of, but it gave us an opportunity to show old favourites in a new context, and particularly in the book where a scientist called Peter Jarman, many years, who is Australian, came into the museum many years ago and was on the cusp of retirement and was obviously worried about not having enough to do. So he'd been looking at digitized manuscripts in collections across the world and looking inevitably as a zoologist at the representation of animals and just happened on Mughal painting. And so he looked at some of our Minto pages with beautiful borders with tiny birds in them, and had been looking at them and analysing them, and saw that many of them were very, very accurate representations of birds. Some were mythical, but then he went on to do a whole study of much wider study. And so he did a chapter for the book analysing some of the exotic birds and animals that were in all sorts of contexts. And so he included these, obviously, but these are known stories. But then started to look at other borders, and for instance, here all the birds are native species except for these helmeted guinea fowl at the bottom. But he also looked at this very beautiful, very famous painting in the British Library, and analysed them from a naturalist point of view, and said birds and mammals might be found in Kashmir in autumn. The usual identification of the squirrels is that they're Eurasian squirrels. He suggests that they're a related species of Caucasian squirrels, which, because the big question is that these are not native species, but they're obviously done from life. I mean, the artist has shown them in such a way, he clearly saw them. So the question is, how did he see them? And Peter Jarman said that these Caucasian squirrels are a bit nearer to the Indian subcontinent, but still only as near as Fars province of Iran. So that's still quite a long way. So his conclusion is, that his suggestion is, did they come as pets, which is very possible. On the other things were known to have come as pets, or perhaps were they brought to Kashmir to establish a fur industry? So that just is an open question. But one of the things he also pointed out, which I'm not sure anyone else has noticed, is the bird of paradise, which I hope we'll get to in a second. Right, fine. The bird of paradise, which is, he pointed out, is often associated directly with either the emperors or references to their lineage. And so he suggests that this is an exotic bird, and he suggests that it would usually have come as a skinned bird, not as a live bird. But it does very often appear in association with either the emperors themselves, so on this imperial canopy, or next to one of the standards that gives the lineage of the Mughal emperors. Now, the next slide is one of the big discoveries in metalwork, again done by Suren, which is the Lahore School of Metalwork. Lahore, of course, has been a centre of metalworking for centuries, and the astrolabes of Humayun, the family, are associated with Lahore. But this is a very important piece which the David collection had the foresight to acquire, which was made for an Armenian in Lahore. We know that because it says it was made for an Armenian in Lahore on it, and it was made in 1616. And so this is a huge piece, it's that size. But then there are earlier indications of a Lahore school of metalwork. And one of the most important things is this candlestick, which was published in a very small, blurry picture. It's in, as you can see, the shrine in Mashhad. And this is absolutely fundamentally important because it says not only the name of the designer, but also the name of the person who cast it, and says that it was made in Lahore with the date. So extraordinarily important thing. We didn't think we'd get the picture, but through the efforts of Abdullah Sudavar, who sent a friend to photograph it in the shrine. It was on a shelf, obviously in a corner that was badly lit. So you can see, I hope, the really beautiful design and how characteristically Safavid it is, and yet with Mughal elements. And so we had a whole series of metalwork that came after that, which is associated in stylistic terms with Lahore, and is associated with the elite of the court. So some of them are, there's one Safavid prince who commissioned the candlestick, and others are names that are mentioned in contemporary chronicles of Jahangir and Shah Jahan. Then we have a very, you might have just walked past this if you were in the exhibition, particularly if you went in the last couple of weeks, because the light failed above the case, unfortunately. This is the most exciting sword for arms and armour people. This is a dynastic sword of Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Alamgir, and the curators of the Royal Collection, Simon Metcalfe and Francesca Levy, have traced its lineage right up to 1857. It stayed in the Emperor's hands. It was obviously incredibly important. And Francesca Levy did a paper at the V&A conference and is obviously still working on the metal analysis that they've had done. And interestingly, she pointed out it's always been a question I've had: how long does it take people to do these inscriptions? And she said that she'd put that question to a master inlayer of metal, and he'd said about 2 weeks, which I thought was absolutely astonishing because it seems very short. Then we go into the reign of Shah Jahan, who inevitably is overshadowed by the Taj Mahal, and any marketing that ever comes out mentioning Shah Jahan always says builder of the Taj Mahal. So I was, just as a kind of reaction to that, at one point I wanted to put the Taj Mahal in a little corner where you could just walk past it, because you know, there are other things to say about the reign of Shah Jahan. However, it became obvious that one, that would be stupid, and two, the Taj Mahal itself is extremely important because it sets the artistic style of the reign. So you get the floral decoration on the walls, and you also get all this inlay. Sorry, oh, this is really irritating, sorry. So we put in a little bit with this tiny model of the cenotaph of Mumtaz Mahal, which when I saw a picture of it, I imagined it to be that big. And when it came, it was that big, so it couldn't be the centerpiece. But it just shows the technique of inlay, which has been called pietra dura by most people, including me. And we realized doing the exhibition and talking to a PhD student who was studying Florentine pietra dura and Indian inlay techniques that it wasn't. It's a completely different technique, which is rooted in ancient traditions. I don't know how far it goes back in India, but the inlay directly into the marble of these stones. And this is, the drawings were written up by Divya Patel in the book, and we mentioned this inlay and the misnomer of calling it pietra dura. But the continuation of the tradition, you can see here, where it's slightly damaged, you can see it's inlaid straight into the marble. It's not an overlay, as it would be, of the pietra dura is like a jigsaw, which is then applied in a panel. But you can see from these wonderful unpublished pieces from the Al-Sabah collection, we put 4 balustrades in, how beautiful the continuing tradition was in the 19th century, as evidenced by these pieces, but also by the inlays into the Golden Temple in Amritsar, which has marvellous inlaid walls and a floor, actually, there's a detail on the floor which is usually hidden by the Guru Granth Sahib. But this would be an area to research further if there's anything else that can be linked to the period between the Shah Jahan and the 20th century tourist stuff. So then in Shah Jahan's reign, I wanted to highlight the superlative Mughal craftsmanship of enamelling, which is a foreign technique taken up and completely transformed, and producing pieces like this, again from the Al-Sabah collection. All the enamels came from them. There was one piece I wanted to show as well from the Bashir Muhammad family collection, but it doesn't lend itself to being shown on the slide. It's a small miniature Quran box with the most exquisite Jahangir period enamel, but that is properly photographed in the book, so you can see it there. But I also wanted to highlight Shah Jahan in other guises, particularly as a renowned connoisseur of gemstones. And I mentioned here, you see him holding a Colombian emerald, and the size would not be exaggerated. These emeralds were big, and we know that the emeralds in Mughal jewellery were Colombian because the Colombian emeralds have very distinctive inclusions, which leave no doubt for gemologists where they came from. And I'll just mention the highly important spinel here, which bears the Ulugh Beg inscription. It was inscribed first for him, but also has the inscription, which we know was done by Saidar. So that's how you get the example of his handwriting. And of course, the royal women would have worn these as much jewellery as the men, but we have so few contemporary paintings that it's difficult to track them. One of the other things I really wanted to do was to continue to highlight throughout the exhibition the way that the same motifs were used in completely different materials. And so you have the rock crystal wine bowl on the right and the velvet on the left, which use very similar motifs. But more specifically, you can see the vase motif used on these glazed tiles from Lahore and replicated on the carpet fragment. So very close relationship between the designers and the craftsmen. The other thing that I included was these unpublished tiles, and we've got a very significant collection of glazed Mughal tiles from the reign of Shah Jahan in the V&A, but I've never seen anything like these before. The ones on the right from Kuwait. The one on the left, if you saw it on its own, it would be difficult to know whether it was produced in Iran or the Mughal Empire. But when you see the two together, the designs on the right, the borders particularly, and the colour, the brown and the green and the yellow together, are absolutely Mughal. And the motifs are similar. I mean, they're not identical, but there are very strong similarities between the leaves in particular and some of the centres of the flowers. So I think there's no doubt that they're made within the empire, but where they're made in the northern provinces is an open question. And then the rock crystal I also included, because again we have a remarkable collection in the V&A, which was acquired originally by Colonel Guthrie, who is remembered now mostly for his jade acquisitions, but actually some of the rock crystals came from him if you go through the provenance history, because although this came from a collector of rock crystal, he'd acquired it from the Guthrie sale in 1875. And the creativity of the design of these pieces is extraordinary, because when it really exploits the transparency of the material, so that when you see it from one side, you see one perspective of the design, and then when you see it from above, it looks like a completely different work of art. So it's a wonderful way of exploiting this transparency, and often the design that's worked onto the surface very cunningly conceals minute imperfections in the rock crystal. So the more you look at them, the more extraordinary the craftsmanship comes out. And then I finish with the enigma, because I said at the beginning, the things that were unresolved. And I think this is one of our most one of the most famous Mughal works of art. And yet we know virtually nothing about it. I mean, Robert Skelton wrote about it and analysed the design influences impeccably. But all we know is its date, because it's written on it. We know that it was done for Shah Jahan because it has his title on it. But who made it? We have no idea. So perhaps in future, some scholar will find a poem written in praise of Shah Jahan's cup. So thank you very much.
Yeah. So I'll Susan will take some questions, but I'll ask the first one. And it's going to come from the side a little bit. I noticed that there was nothing from the collection in India or Pakistan in the exhibition, and I was curious as to whether why that was there
You're not the first person. It was mostly the pandemic, because I started to put the object list together as soon as things started to get back to normal, after at a time when we couldn't travel very much. The first objects that I listed were all things that I knew very well. And when I've been to India and Pakistan, it's usually been to look at monuments rather than museum collections. So the pieces that I would have liked to research, for instance, the Lahore Museum has apparently a basement full of tiles, and they're just listed. There's a description of them just with no images, and I would like to have included things like that. Cost is another element. So if you want works on paper, the European and particularly London collections are very rich, but it was mostly the result of the pandemic. I think.
Peace. And certainly, many things.
Yeah, well, that's the David collection who bought that, I think, from Sam Fogg. So that's their, mutual discovery. But Suren and Simon used to sit bidding against each other at auction. And I think Simon's remark would be exactly the sort of thing that Suren says, that when you look at things as a Safavid, if you haven't spent years collecting, you miss the small details which give away the fact that it's not entirely Safavid. So there'll be, a petal on a parmet or something like that, which is, or the arrangement of the design, which is wrong. And I remember looking at jewelry that looked to me 19th century jewelry that looked to me to be European. And I'd discuss it with experts in the V&A, and they'd say, well, no, it can't possibly be European, even though the form and the setting and everything looks European, and they give me, minute but very specific details that reveal it. So that's the connoisseur's eye, I think. Absolutely, yeah. But also looking so closely at things. I mean, now, we've got so many digital images. It's easy just to scan them. But if you actually hold an object and look at it, yeah, everything. So it gives you completely different knowledge. Though, on the other hand, a digital image can show you things you can't actually see, you know. So,
Looking at the book, do we know how illustration very well because very evocative. I mean, what was the actual purpose?
that's a lot of questions, Boundary. all very good. Who would have seen them? I presume, I mean, this is going off my area of expertise, but I presume that, you know, they're in a library. There are a lot of scholars. I presume that the libraries were open to scholars who needed to look at the books. Then the manuscripts would be copied, and Jahangir's memoirs, of course, were copied for distribution with his intention that they would provide a lesson to other rulers. So, you know, there were certain propagandist elements as well. Shah Jahan, of course, controlled his histories much more. So obviously he had you can see through the works of clear sense of an imperial image, a very specific image that he wanted to project. So you saw the painting of him standing on the globe, which is the allusion to his title, Shah Jahan, King of the World. So all sorts of multiple uses of the books, but in terms of access, I presume that they would be, I don't know if anyone else has got more informed comments to make, but I presume that they would be open to anyone who was, you know, interested in and able to read them, which would be a huge audience.
Okay. Positioning of
One of the remarks in the pitch was the Cosmopolitan Court. I mean, that was definitely part of it. I mean, a V&A exhibition has to appeal to a very varied audience. So it has to appeal to people who will know a huge amount about the subject. And then it has to appeal to people who just want to see a good exhibition or want to learn more, or, you know, this may be an unfamiliar world, or they may know it from, you know, history, but not know the art history. So it's always best to be as simple as possible without talking down to the audience, but be as an informative, you know, explain things without it sounding as if, you know, you're saying to the audience, you know, you're stupid, you don't understand this. You know, it's got to be very accessible. So the simplicity was a great driving force. The subject came about because it's the thing I'm most interested in. It was going to be the last exhibition I did before retiring. So these are objects that I've known for most of them, not all of them, for a long time. And I just wanted to put them together into a show which would show just how fantastic the workmanship was, apart from the, you know, they are beautiful objects as well. But at the same time, explain the complicated context of the court and its culture without, and I mentioned this at the beginning, I didn't want to concentrate exclusively on the emperors as patrons, but it ended up being quite difficult to tell a more complicated story because things do get oversimplified. You know, you've got a label with 50 words of text in it, which is quite difficult. You know, it's always for a museum curator, it's always quite a challenge to do that. So there's a lot of balancing as you go through. You know, you start with a vague idea and then it gets a bit more refined, and then you don't get a loan, so you have to miss that bit of the story out, although that didn't happen much. So it's quite a complicated process. Thank you.
I an object follows fish. Three, an object that can be
Well, the last one is easiest actually, because I would have loved to have put in the Gulshan album pages from Tehran, which are, you know, these are the greatest works done for Jahangir. And we didn't even try. It just, you know, that was a non-starter. So that's what I wish that we could have put in. My favourite object in the V&A is probably the jade pendant, jewel jade pendant that I showed at the beginning, and was on the title slide. And what was the second one? Oh, in the V&A. Well, the velvet canopy would be would be good. I think many of the things that we borrowed, actually, I think I'd be very happy to see in the V&A, but then these things should be shared out, I think, between institutions. Okay. Thank you. I don't know. I mean, looked at that and wondered myself, you know, what sort of question that was. I don't know, but it is a strange thing that they're obviously done from life and they're not native species, so it's an open question. Well, of course, the big question is, you know, how when were imports made? You know, what was happening in the early 17th century compared with now? I mean, we can't know.
I have one last question. And you mentioned at the very beginning that there were things about the exhibition that you wished had been done differently or had been done better. And I know that you have, there's only so much one can do because we've already printed the catalog, but you have, you know, 2 other bites at the apple with Hong Kong and Virginia. Will there be any changes?
Well, as I'm retired, I won't be.
Oh, not yet.
But I think that's the great thing about a touring exhibition, that, you know, my intention that when I pitched it, I said, because it's on for quite a long time, post-COVID exhibition lengths are much greater. Therefore, works on paper are very you know, so you have to have light level correspondingly lower. And I always said that whoever took, if it did tour, that the local curator should be prepared to borrow from satellite collections works on paper, and then it would become their exhibition much more. It's more of a creative process than taking a package and just installing it. So that was always the idea. Now, Hong Kong doesn't have those satellite collections, so it will be different. I honestly don't know how it's developing. It'll have a core of objects which are going from the show, but obviously not the light sensitive ones. And then Richmond, Virginia, where it'll open in May 26, I think it'll be wonderful because they'll be putting in a whole new range of things, and they've got a very engaged curator there. And my replacement at the V&A, Emily Hannam, is very involved in both of them. So that's a high standard ensured. So, and I don't have to write any of the label.
Well, those curators will get very detailed report from us regarding light levels for our Google which is- Well, thank you very much, Susan. That was a great talk.